when we apply this schedule, this scheme to Brexit, then you'll see that the initiative for the referendum came actually from the government. The decision was made by the citizens, but the process was actually ad hoc, non-foreseeable, and therefore also a little bit victim to arbitrary rules making, right? So there was no pathway to follow for a referendum of this scale on the national level in the UK. There was no clear view of what the outcomes would be. Nobody really knew what the question on the ballot entailed, like what the consequences of it would be. And so therefore this for us falls rather under like not really best practices as a referendum. Not to That doesn't mean it's not a democratic practice. There was a fair campaign. People did vote in a certain way, but it is not what we would constitute as a good example of direct democracy. If we look at countries where the process is very clear, but the initiative is not with the citizens, is still not with the citizens, then, for example, we can move to the next door neighbors of the UK, that's Ireland. They have a mandatory referendum, meaning that if they want to change the constitution, it is obligatory for citizens to vote. And this has happened in recent memory a couple of times. For example, in 2018, they abolished so the constitution had a ban on abortion specified, which was overthrown in a referendum. So the initiative to change the constitution, in this case, interestingly, came from a citizens' assembly. So a citizens' assembly, I'm sure there are other people who will talk more about them. But a citizens' assembly is a process where people are randomly selected to represent the nation state as a whole and then formulate recommendations. And so one of the recommendations that this citizens' assembly that made many recommendations on very different topics. One of their recommendations was to take this ban on abortion out of the constitution and to provide normal legislation on it. So to also remove it to a different legislative level. And this then automatically triggered a referendum, because in Ireland, if you want to change the constitution, you have to put it to a vote. And in the case of abortion, this meant that that this was taken out of the constitution. But last year, for example, interestingly, there were 2 votes on changing the constitution of Ireland on the role of women in the home, because Ireland's constitution also specifies that the role of women is in the home and that they should be given special support as caregivers. And this one, interestingly, was denied. So this remains in the constitution, and there are many reasons for that we can go into deeper later if you want to. But just to give you an idea of what we consider a mandatory referendum. And then finally, if we look at something that sort of ticks all the boxes on leaving the control with the citizens, so meaning that citizens can initiate legislation, citizens can vote on legislation, and there is a clear process that guides citizens to do this, that allows them to continuously do this. Then we can look at Switzerland. In Switzerland, citizens are called to vote 4 times a year. These dates are known, so it's always on a weekend. These dates are known 10 times in advance. I can look up when the voting day in November in 2034 is going to be in Switzerland. And for those days, they collect all possible legislative initiatives from citizens that should be voted on. For this, there's a process where people have to, of course, formulate legislation that they would like to propose. They have to collect signatures. This usually takes, so from starting to collect signatures to having your question on the ballot, it usually takes a couple of years. It's not a quick process, but it's a very foreseeable process that leads to very interesting votes sometimes. So Switzerland has voted on many things. For example, like one of my favorite ones is that they wanted to add to the constitution that it's forbidden to cut the horns of cows because it harms them. And then of course the farmers said yes, but it's important for cows to have their horns cut because otherwise they fight with each other. And so this is it. What it leads to is a very interesting debate on a societal scale, because people have to convince their fellow citizens that this is a good idea. Yes, and so and it's a very clear process, and it also happens in Switzerland that people decide one year that they, I don't know, don't want to abolish the army, but a couple of years later they change their mind. So it allows for also the consciousness of people to evolve and for society to move on, which is obviously a process that happens by itself. So when we look at direct democracy of this kind in Europe, there are about 750 instruments of direct democracy in Europe. That's including the local level. So there are many municipalities that have tools of this kind, so that allow citizens to collect signatures or to vote on issues rather than candidates. Most of these are on the subnational level. So on the regional level, this is, for example, the Bundesländer in Germany, the states of Germany all have some kind of citizens' initiative legislation in place. There are many cities, around 30% of these instruments are on city level. For example, there are some interesting combinations there also with digital democracy. For example, Madrid and Barcelona both have very extensive online citizens initiative tools that allow citizens to post proposals for their city online, where people can also discuss it and vote it, and it then gets adopted by the city council. And about 18% of these are on the national level. This is just a handful of countries in Europe. Not your usual suspects, and also not always perfect practice, of course. But for example, Albania, Bulgaria, Finland, and the ones I've mentioned, Switzerland and Ireland. Yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to touch upon, and then I think it would be good if we can go to questions, is the transnational level, because the EU doesn't only have direct democracy instruments on local, regional, and national levels, but also very crucially one on the transnational level. So not all countries in Europe, of course, but many of them are bound together in the European Union, which has many flaws and a very well documented democratic deficit, but it has a couple of democratic innovations that we really don't see anywhere else in the world. And one of them is the European Citizens Initiative. So the EU allows citizens to collect signatures and to propose legislation to the European Commission. The Commission being the equivalent of the government, if we would talk about the nation state. Of course, with less powers than a government has, because the EU is also a sort of a coalition of the willing in that sense. But so if you can convince 1 million citizens in at least 7 member states of the EU, then the Commission promises to have a good look at your proposal and to come up with ways to implement it. And of course, this last part is relatively voluntary, and this is of course what a lot of people criticize. So we would classify it as an agenda-setting initiative. It allows citizens to put something on the agenda, on the political agenda, but it of course is in no way binding, which also wouldn't make sense, because when 1 million people out of 500 million people sign something, that doesn't make a majority. And in about 12 years of existence, we've seen about 116 European Citizens Initiative registered, so organizations that have thought that this was a good idea and have tried to use this tool to really bring about political change. About 12 of those have made the 1 million hurdle, which is of course 1 million signatures is a very, very high hurdle. It's very difficult to collect 1 million signatures in at least 7 member states. Two of those are being verified right now, and 10 of them have been answered by the European Commission. So that's a success rate of about 10%, a little less. Um, and if you manage to do all of this, we've been really working on making it more binding also. So the European Parliament has stepped in also, allowing successful initiatives to present their case to Parliament. And so if the Parliament thinks that the Commission's response is insufficient, often the Parliament steps in and proposes something. So there's this interesting dynamic that you have in the European Union between the executive and the legislative powers. Yeah, and it has led in Europe to policies on drinking waters, pesticides, farming, how you can keep farm animals. Humane farming. Yeah, and I think it's, as I said, it's been criticized as being a weak tool. But I think we can also not underestimate its successes in really bringing topics to the European agenda, and then really bringing these topics to the fore, and then to people's minds, and forcing some legislation, even if campaigners don't always get 100% of what they were pushing for, but it's always a first step in a process. And I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for like a wonderful presentation. I will quickly make a summary in French for French speakers. Brièvement, Caroline a essayé d'expliquer ce que c'est que la démocratie directe. Et c'est quand même une démocratie, bon, elle tenait quand même à expliquer que c'est une démocratie où les citoyens ont, on va dire, une capacité de décision, d'une influence dans les législations qui sont finalement prises. Et quand elle parle de citoyens, ce n'est pas seulement le fait d'être né quelque part, mais c'est vraiment ceux qui sont directement affectés par les politiques publiques et une façon qu'elle a donnée de pouvoir décider si une démocratie est qualifiée comme directe ou non, c'est d'aller voir qui est en mesure de présenter les initiatives pour une législation, qui est en mesure de décider ce qui sera soumis au vote et finalement ce qui sera l'issue de ce vote. Et finalement, le processus à suivre pour permettre la législation. Donc, il faut aller voir quel rôle les citoyens jouent à ces différents niveaux. Est-ce que les lois sont proposées par le Parlement ou par les citoyens directement? Est-ce que les citoyens peuvent voter ou c'est directement voté par le Parlement? Donc, c'est un ensemble de critères à utiliser pour décider si réellement on a affaire à une démocratie directe ou non. Elle a donné quelques exemples, comme par exemple au Royaume-Uni, il y avait l'initiative pour le Brexit où il y a eu un référendum. L'initiative est venue du gouvernement. Le public pouvait voter, mais le processus a été perçu comme arbitraire, ce qui n'est pas peut-être pas un bon exemple de démocratie directe. Il y a aussi l'Irlande où il y a un système de référendum obligatoire où les citoyens doivent voter pour modifier la Constitution et cela a été fait plusieurs fois au cours des dernières années. Un exemple, on va dire, plutôt réussi qu'elle a donné, c'est celui de la Suisse, qui ont 4 votes programmés par an, qui sont programmés à l'avance, et les citoyens ont la possibilité de lancer des initiatives. Et en tout, en Europe, il y a environ 750 instruments de démocratie directe. Et au niveau transnational, l'Union européenne propose l'initiative citoyenne européenne qui permet aux citoyens de soumettre des propositions à la Commission européenne. Et pour inscrire une proposition à l'agenda, il leur faut convaincre 1 million de citoyens à travers au moins 7 pays de l'Union européenne. Mais jusqu'à présent, sur 116 initiatives enregistrées, il y en a très peu qui répondent aux exigences et qui vont jusqu'à être implémentées. Donc, c'est un taux de succès d'environ 10%. Donc, mais au-delà des limites du système, c'est bien que ces instruments existent et que les citoyens peuvent avoir leur mot et proposer quelques initiatives. Donc, en gros, c'était ça. Merci beaucoup, Caroline. On a des questions qui ont été posées en ligne dans le chat aussi. Mais on va passer à la prochaine présentation et on revient après pour faire une session de questions générales. So we will listen now to our next panelist, and then at the end of that presentation, we'll have one big Q&A session. So you can save your questions, you can ask them in the chat, and we will move now to our next panelist. Thanks again, Caroline. So
Thank
now
you.
we are welcoming our last panelist for today's first panel. It is Professor Ricardo Fabrino Mendoza. Professor Ricardo is an esteemed associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil, with a profound commitment to advancing democratic theories and practices, coordinates the Malhem Research Group on Democracy and Justice, and is a fellow at INCT Digital Democracy. Professor Mendoza is a distinguished scholar with extensive research interest in democratic theory, contentious politics, and political communication. He is an associate researcher and long-term collaborator with the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. His scholarly contributions include being one of the authors of Algorithmic Institutionalism by Oxford University Press and one of the editors of Crisis and Democracy in the Public Sphere and Research Methods in Deliberative Democracy. Today, Professor Mendoza will share his insight on the collective mandate in Brazil, a transformative approach that seeks to redefine political representation and engagement. His exploration of this innovative model promises to provide us with a deeper understanding of how democratic systems can adapt to the needs and aspirations of citizens and complex political landscapes. So as we conclude in this panel, I really encourage you to engage during this presentation and to think of your question and ask them in the chat or save them for later for our Q&A session. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Mendoza to our panel. Professor Mendoza, we are really excited to hear from you today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Yes. And may I share my screen to use a presentation?
Yes, absolutely.
Is it working?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here and to be discussing these ways to move democracy forward in these very troubling times, in these very difficult times in which you have to face all sorts of dimensions and elements leading to democratic erosion, to democratic crisis. So discussing possibilities and ways forward in which to enhance and to promote democracy is always good in this in these times that we can be frustrated easily. So thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the ideas and of the work I have been dealing with. So I'll be talking about collective mandates in Brazil, which is not the usual role when you expect someone from Brazil to be speaking about democratic innovations. Brazil is very famous and named as a democratic lab for its democratic innovations, with a history of participatory budget, policy councils, and policy conferences that have become famous due to their scale. Some of these initiatives, like the conferences, can have thousands and thousands of people spread over the society in different localities, in different states, and at the federal level. The continuity of this process. So we have had experiences that go over years and years and years with possibilities of accountability and of revising decisions and of changing and moving things forward. And also due to their empowerment, when we think about the initial initiatives of participatory budgeting, for instance, or policy councils, how they can have that they are part of the policy cycle and they can have actual consequences in terms of their implications. Sometimes, not always. But so there has been a huge interest in participatory budgeting, policy councils, and policy conferences throughout the history of Brazil, and now also citizens' assemblies. But this empowerment proved to be fragile once we had a government under Bolsonaro that was specifically intended to end these initiatives that considered participatory experiments a problem to develop policy, and that aimed deliberatively to extinguish some of these initiatives. And over the past years, actually not only under the Bolsonaro government, but at least since 2015, 2016, and with attempts to move forward and to strengthen the participatory initiatives, there has been a backlash, pushback, and many of these initiatives have been weakened. So at this moment, we are in a time to reconstruct and to rethink and to reconceive of some of these initiatives that are attempts to reinvent what participatory budgeting should mean today, how policy councils should work, and how conferences should be more impactful. But I would like to talk about a different sort of innovation that has happened in Brazil over the past years. And I'm talking here about collective candidacies and collective mandates. And what I'll try to argue here is a theoretical lens to make sense of another type of democratic innovation that has emerged as an innovation that sought to occupy legislatures. So collective candidacies and collective mandates are directly linked to representative politics, and they are an intent to change how representation is constituted, and they are very informal. They are not very designed. And that's what I would like to argue today, that sometimes the creativity and the possibilities to push the boundaries of democracy does not emerge from design, but emerge from the creativity that can be risky. And that's the argument. So I'll be talking today about a book chapter written with two co-authors, Lucas Gelapi and Esteban Cruz, in a book edited by Adrian Vioa and Sonia Busu, recently published by Routledge, in which we talk about these collective candidacies and what are collective candidacies. So collective candidacies are candidacies in which a group of people collectively demand the same and one seat in parliament, affirming the commitment to share decisions and other actions of the mandate among the members of that specific group. So they run as a group, they mobilize votes as a group, they announce that they will be sharing the seat and that they will produce the decisions collectively and that they will be accountable as a group and not as a single individual. And this started slowly, but it grew. And now you have collective candidacies and collective mandates in several municipalities, in several states, and you have hundreds of groups running for a single seat. And this has pushed the boundaries of how parliaments work, of how elections are thought of how representation is conceived of, and this has triggered attempts to analyze and to make sense of how innovative can this be. And we try to make sense of this through a word. It may seem odd, but that is gambiarra. And I'll go back and explain what gambiarra is in a few seconds. But but collective mandates, when we look at collective mandates often give emphasis to overlooked issues and bring different bodies to representative politics. So Brazil has a history of underrepresenting women in parliaments. Historically, it's around 8, 10%, now 15. And several groups of women decided to run together in order to to augment their chances to be elected. And when we look at collective mandates, women represent 60% of these collective mandates. Half of the elected individuals representing collective mandates declare to be non-white. And also, there is a huge racial gap in Brazilian representation. And so there's also an attempt to promote the representation of non-white individuals. More than half of the collectives are represented by people under 39 years old of age, so also youngsters, and 80.83% from left and center-left parties. This is another data that has been raised by several researchers that have been dealing with collective mandates. So our theoretical argument is that we can make sense of collective mandates as gambiarras. And what are gambiarras? Gambiarras, it's a difficult word to translate to English. It's like workaround, stopgap, quick fix, but it's an attempt to deal with an existing problem with whatever resources are at hand in a creative way that can lead to solutions to immediate problems, but which can also lead to short circuits and to which can also lead to big problems. So gambiarras, it's a word we use all the time in Portuguese to talk about these everyday creative inventions, everyday tactical practices that deal with concrete problems with the resources available, displacing potential ways of looking at resources and of looking at problems. And that can lead to these short circuits and risks, as I had mentioned. So here, the picture of an attempt to fix shower. And we have we use gambiarras to talk about many different everyday tactics and uses to uh, hold a cup, or to fix a chair with a bottle, or to cross the street flooded, or to fix glasses, or even to change, if there's a musician in the room, to change the way that a guitar would sound, not with stable elements to fix a problem, but with unsteady, sometimes shaky, creative elements dealing with the problem with the resources available. And our argument is that we often do that when we think about politics and when we think about democracies. We tend to think about how to improve democracies through very designed mini publics and through very designed initiatives. But often we are dealing with gambiarras, with quick fixes that are trying to deal with problems that cannot be completely designed, but that are dealing with the resources available, and that can change the way we relate to politics. So we argue in this paper that gambiarras can foster change in at least two ways. First, if we think in institutional terms, in a critical juncture, political actors can produce a whole set of new rules and institutions by pushing the boundaries of the existing institutions. And collective mandates have often done that. They have uh, 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 asked for demands that were not expected in institutions. They have reconstructed the offices of representatives to make it more appropriate for groups of people. They have demanded forms of accountability that are not very common in representative politics. They have often asked for things for the institution in itself that are not very usual. For instance, and I'll cite one example, when one group of individuals composing one specific mandate required security because they were receiving death threats, and the institution was not sure how to deal with it because obviously the resources should be applied to one specific individual officially occupying that seat and not to the group in itself. So collective mandates in a certain way represent these attempts to push the boundaries of existing institutions, claiming for change in an unexpected way and changing the way that problems are often conceived of. Second, under a scenario of disputes, political actors work on the margins of existing norms to establish new institutions and or give new meanings to the existing ones. So you have disputes and you have political actors from the margins, not from the center of the organization of strategies of institutional change, but from the margins in a creative way, in a tactical way, pushing the boundaries of existing institutions, and in this way claiming for change. Gambiarras then represent, and I apologize, but I'm concerned here because I saw that I'm maybe running out of battery. So I'll just put my charger on. I'm sorry. Going back to the presentation now, and now is energy. So these improvised artifacts are nevertheless inherently ambivalent. On the one hand, they are fragile and potentially dangerous. They are unsteady, and they're made to be unsteady because otherwise permanent solutions would not be necessary. But they can lead to huge problems due to their unsteadiness, due to the dangers inherent to it. And I'll mention some examples deriving from collective mandates in Brazil. On the other hand, gambiarras express human ingenuity. They are artifacts produced by a practical creativity in the face of needs. And that's what we may need when we look at democracy and when we think about the difficulties of designing a whole new ways to enhance democracy. How do we deal with the resources available in a specific context in order to promote better democracy in very practical terms? So, having acknowledged the creativity, the potential, and the way that pushing the boundaries of existing institutions is relevant in democratic terms, we can also talk about the short circuits, the dangers deriving from these gambiarras and from the collective mandates here specifically. The first one is the absence of regulation and legal recognition. So collective mandates in Brazil had to face several experiences in terms of how can we register a group to be voted and to appear to the electors as a group and not as a single individual, which is what officially and formally happens. And more than that, once we are elected, how do we all speak? How do we get access to the tribune? And they have made creative inventions in order to do that. In one state, for instance, one of the representatives recorded the voices of all the others and played the voices of all the others in the tribune in order to make the group visible and accessible. But they're dealing all the time with the absence of regulation and with these gaps. So, how do we get protection and security and access to resources as a group and not as a single individual? The second one is relationships with parties and with other representatives. Sometimes collective mandates have individuals from different parties, or individuals from one party and individuals with no party affiliation at all. Then you have all sorts of conflicts. And also you have uh, elements and contingent elements happening. In my municipality, Belo Horizonte, for instance, there was a huge campaign for a collective candidacy. They were elected, and the person that was formally and officially the name in the ballot resigned after 6 months. And then the whole group was unsure if the party would host the other members of the collective mandate or if the seat in itself would simply move to the next person in line and they would lose all the possibilities of voice accountability and vote that they had. There are cases of sick leave, health leave, and how to deal with these relationships and different parties dealing with collective mandates in different ways, sometimes fighting with these collective mandates. Sometimes there are struggles over power in terms of if the collective mandate should be obliged to follow party directions or the types of liberty and freedom that these collective mandates should have. So you have all sorts of problems and short circuits happening in the relationship between these co-representatives, as we call them, and their relationships with parties in itself. And third, you have the challenges for the organization and socialization of power, so access to resources, access to the to the prerogatives of the house in itself, and how to organize and distribute power among the members of this specific group, specifically because throughout the process, things happen. So some of these collective mandates have actually registered a document saying about talking about the different expectations, the different prerogatives, the different how to solve decisions, how to deal with conflicts, and establishing like a formal agreement with parties in order to assess different types of resources. But this has often not been the case. And once the collective candidacy is elected and becomes a collective mandate, you have all sorts of disputes and struggles over power, and it often explodes in short circuits as gambiarras. So to conclude, and that's basically my argument. And this can be talking about gambiarras here. It's that the ways to reinvent democracy are not often completely designable and are not completely controllable in this way. We need to deal with everyday practices that reinvent democracy and that push the boundaries of institutions and that create new problems that can be very risky for democracy. And so dealing with the ambivalences of democratic change and of institutional change is an interesting way of looking at democratic innovations beyond the more recurrent way of looking at them as attempts to redesign democracy. So thank you, and I'll leave it here, and I'm open for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendoza. It was a really interesting presentation. Again, I will do a quick review from summary in French for our French speakers before we move to the Q&A session. Donc, en gros, ce qui a été dit dans la présentation du professeur Mendoza, c'est que le Brésil est un pays qui est quand même renommé pour ses innovations démocratiques qui sont souvent de très grande envergure, tels que le budget participatif, les conseils de politique publique et les conférences. Cependant, ces formes d'émancipation ont été fragilisées sous la présidence de Jair Bolsonaro, qui a tenté de les supprimer. Donc, par conséquent, ces mécanismes-là ont été affaiblis, mais il y a récemment eu un nouveau format qui est les mandats collectifs. Donc, ces mandats ont été décrits comme une tentative d'occuper les législatures en permettant à un groupe de personnes de demander collectivement un siège au Parlement et de partager le siège tout en prenant des décisions de manière collective. Donc, c'est un phénomène qui a commencé lentement, mais qui a pris de l'ampleur et qui apparaît désormais dans plusieurs municipalités. Et il modifie la manière dont les élections fonctionnent et la conception qu'on a de la représentation, vu que il ne s'agit pas là de candidats individuels, mais d'un groupe de personnes qui se portent candidats et qui promettent de partager le pouvoir. Et il semble que c'est aussi un mécanisme qui permet à des groupes qui sont normalement exclus d'avoir une meilleure chance d'être élus. Donc, les femmes représentent 60% des mandats collectifs et il y a une répartition de moitié de personnes non blanches et moitié de personnes aussi de moins de 30 ans. Donc, c'est les jeunes, c'est les personnes racialisées, c'est les femmes et beaucoup de personnes aussi qui ont une forte proportion, qui ont une forte orientation politique de gauche ou centre-gauche sont ceux-là qui se présentent souvent à travers ces mandats collectifs. Donc, le professeur Mendoza a décrit les mandats collectifs comme des gambiaras, qui sont des pratiques tactiques quotidiennes qui sont utilisées pour aborder des problèmes concrets en utilisant les ressources disponibles. Donc, les gambiaras, c'est, on va dire, une solution qui est peut-être temporaire, qui est assez instable, mais qui sert quand même à pousser les institutions, à forcer les institutions qui existent à se renouveler parce qu'elles posent des questions importantes. Donc, les mandats collectifs ont amené de nouveaux sujets de conversation et ils forcent quand même à un renouvellement du système politique qui existe actuellement. Il y a encore beaucoup de difficultés au niveau de l'absence de réglementation et de reconnaissance légale, au niveau des relations avec les partis et les autres représentations, et aussi des défis qui sont liés à l'organisation et à la socialisation du pouvoir. Mais en dépit des dangers, on va dire, des risques qui sont associés au système, elle représente quand même, on va dire que ces mandats collectifs représentent une manifestation de la créativité humaine et c'est cette créativité-là qu'il nous faut pour aller vers les innovations démocratiques pour réellement renouveler nos systèmes démocratiques, il faudra faire preuve de créativité. Et c'est un peu, on va dire, le message principal de cette présentation. Donc, once more, thank you, Professor Mendoza. We will move now to the Q&A session. So for both your presentation and Professor Caroline's presentation, we have a number of questions in the chat. We will receive 5 or 6 questions. So if someone wants to open the microphone and ask a question, or ask it in the chat, I will start with some of the questions that have already been raised in the chat, but feel free to let me know if you have more questions. Going back to Caroline's presentation, one question that came into the chat was why people are afraid and fans of why are people afraid and fans of direct democracy if the Rassemblement National wins the election? I will put it once again in the chat so it may be clearer to read, but it's basically asking why is direct democracy something that is feared in France?
Yeah, I think when we talk about direct democracy, a lot of people are afraid of populism, which is of course I think also what this question is about. We automatically also think at how people vote in elections when they vote for political parties, and I think it's really important to distinguish between representative democracy and direct democracy, and to also trust that people know the difference. So when you're asked who you want to represent you for the next 5 years, then that is a fundamentally different question than when you're asked what you think about cow horns. And it is very difficult, right? To and we see this more and more to decide which party you're going to vote for. We see that voters float from one party to another, that they're very volatile. And I think this has to do with the complexity of the representative system and how abstract it is. It's like, if you're lucky, you live in a democracy, a functioning democracy, where you will have the choice out of a number of parties to represent you. And then when the elections come up once every 4 or 5 years, you can read all of the party programs, and maybe you'll find a party that you agree with for 80%. And then that party goes and forms a government, and the 80% that you agreed with maybe gets watered down because they need to make a coalition agreement or so on. And so it's very intangible. It's very difficult for people to see what's going to come out of this election process. Not to say that it's not important. I don't think we can all decide on everything all the time. I think it's complementary. So what direct democracy does is it allows citizens at given points within these 4 or 5 years legislatures to get their mandate back, to say, there is something that you guys aren't doing anything about, but I think it's important, and enough other people agree with me that I've managed to collect 100,000 signatures, and now we should all decide on it. And it's the interplay, maybe also to put that into perspective, it's the interplay between the parliament and the direct instruments that makes it interesting. So, for example, in Switzerland, you'll often see that that things get adopted in Parliament even before it's put to a vote, because they're anticipating it's going to come up for a vote, and they've realized, like, oh yeah, this is important for people, so let's do something about it. So I would say that generally speaking, in robust systems where the process is clear, these fears of populism, they haven't materialized where there are direct democracy instruments that are frequently used. Yeah, and it works really well actually together with representative democracy.
Okay, thank you so much, Caroline. Peut-être la réponse, c'est justement que dans les situations où il y a cette peur de la démocratie directe, c'est souvent une question de les gens qui ont peur du populisme, que ça tourne trop rapidement vers le populisme. Mais elle explique que quand il y a des structures en place qui permettent de vraiment régulariser le processus, il y a beaucoup plus de bénéfices à tirer d'un système de démocratie directe. ça peut être accompagné en même temps de démocratie représentative. Les gens n'ont pas à décider sur tout, mais avoir cette possibilité-là que quand il y a des problèmes que les législateurs, dont les législateurs ne se rendent pas compte, que les populations puissent attirer leur attention sur ces problèmes-là. C'est un mécanisme de démocratie qui permet quand même d'apporter du nouveau et du positif à nos systèmes démocratiques. Merci beaucoup. Thanks again, Caroline. And we'll move to the next question. I think Badia Ima wants to ask a question. You can open your microphone and ask it.
Oui, merci. Et je voudrais féliciter fortement les deux communicateurs, madame.
Merci beaucoup.
Et féliciter aussi l'initiative de la traduction. Vous faites une excellente traduction qui nous permet de suivre.
J'apprécie.
J'ai deux questions. Alors, je suis le directeur résident du National Institute, Democratic Institute, NDI, qui est un think tank américain, mais basé à Bamako, au Mali, donc en plein Sahel. En plein Sahel, donc, vous voyez directement la faiblesse des institutions démocratiques dans notre région. Et parallèlement, je suis philosophe de formation et je fais des recherches sur comment renforcer ces institutions démocratiques. Voilà pourquoi les deux présentations m'ont beaucoup intéressé. La première question, la participation des citoyens. Certes, il y a un panel qui viendra sur le cas précis de l'Afrique. C'est ça, je pense que c'est Caroline, et c'est juste un commentaire. Et je suis d'accord avec la thèse principale qu'elle a présentée, mais je mets toujours en relation la situation en Europe qui est différente de la situation en Afrique où il y a quelles sont les capacités nécessaires pour que les citoyens participent? Parce que la participation a besoin de capacité, a besoin de compréhension, a besoin de connaissance des processus et des politiques. Et vous avez dans notre contexte comment dirais-je, un personnel électoral, je vais dire les électeurs, près de 90% qui ne peuvent pas lire les textes, qui ne peuvent pas comprendre les enjeux. Et vous avez un système politique qui est sourd, qui ne fait pas l'effort pour aller vers eux. Dans ce cas, comment mettre en place des systèmes véritablement démocratiques? Vous voyez tous les défis qui se posent à notre continent. Mais je suis tellement émerveillé par la présentation du professeur Flavio. Je suis émerveillé par, je pense que quelqu'un a dit que c'est une métaphore, les Cambiara. Pour moi, la démocratie, elle est locale ou elle ne l'est pas. Et je constate que les Cambiara au Brésil tentent de la rendre davantage locale. Alors, et il a dit que c'est fragile, c'est même dangereux. Et parce que certainement pas institutionnalisé. Est-ce qu'il y a des efforts au Brésil pour l'intégrer dans le système politique? Parce qu'en l'intégrant dans le système politique, on fait descendre les institutions au niveau du sol pour que les citoyens au niveau local, au niveau villageois, puissent s'organiser et constituer la base démocratique des institutions politiques au sommet. Voilà, en tout cas, merci pour et tout ce que les deux communicateurs nous ont apporté cet après-midi. Et moi, je suis impatient d'avoir les présentations et de lire, mais surtout d'être en contact avec des chercheurs du Brésil. Je crois qu'on a des choses en commun et la crise de la démocratie représentative nous ramène aussi aux défis en Afrique. Donc aujourd'hui, l'Europe et l'Afrique, on a presque les mêmes défis. Et voilà, donc merci à tous.
For those really interesting questions. I will ask them now to both Caroline and Professor Mendoza. Okay, so the first question is indeed for Professor Caroline, and it concerns the questions of democratic participation. So the question comes from someone who is working in the context of Bamako, who is working in the Sahel region, where there are a great number of difficulties. So it's very different from the European context. So his question is really, in regions like the Sahel, where democratic capacities and citizen participations are limited, the situation is challenging because of high illiteracy rates, and there are a lack of efforts from the political system or those involved in them to try to engage citizens. But how can we develop functional democratic systems under these conditions, and what capabilities are necessary to enable effective citizen participation, and how can we overcome those challenges related to illiteracy and other specific issues in that region? So I will start with Caroline, and I will ask the second question. I don't know if it's clear enough, Caroline.
It was, and I also understood the original question, so merci beaucoup. Je vais répondre en anglais. I will answer in English, and then Magdali can translate. I think that works better. Yeah, of course, there is no such thing on this planet as a 100% direct democracy. I also don't think it would be a good idea. We would all spend our entire day trying to figure out what we think about very specific topics. And so, of course, the presentation I gave today is very, very focused on Europe, right? That's not to say that there isn't direct democratic practice in the rest of the world, and sometimes in difficult contexts. For example, Taiwan, which I know is also a very developed country, but a country that works in a context of conflict or of impeding conflict, has made a decision in 2018 to really open up its legislation to citizens, because they feel that democracy and more democracy is their best defense against the potential conflict with China, for example. But just a side note too, I don't think that in a system that isn't democratic to begin with, that doesn't have possibilities for people to go voting in a safe environment, be it for elections or for a direct democracy process, that doesn't have free media, that's of course not an ideal system for neither for elections nor for direct democracy. So we have to begin with a democratic context, right? Which is why it's also important to look at the possibilities that civil society has, that press freedom has. Are women able to participate equally as men? So all of these things are important, and I don't think that direct democracy is a cure for any of that. It's just a different system in which the same people vote in a different way, right? So if you can't vote safely in an election, you can't vote safely in a direct democratic initiative. On your question on making it more inclusive for people, so there are examples with participatory budgeting, for example, where they use drawings, for example, for people who are illiterate, where they can vote for proposals for their neighborhood, to improve their neighborhood. For example, in Mexico City, this exists in this case for children, but of course children cannot read either, right? And they get a ballot that has drawings on it. Do you want more streetlights? Do you want a playground? So there are, of course, possibilities, right? There are possibilities with, I think, the advent of smartphones. I know that many people who don't otherwise have access to internet actually do own smartphones, even in disadvantaged communities. That opens possibilities of having spoken language materials, right? Not something that you have to read, but or it can also be radio broadcasts. It can be materials that are online. So yeah, it's absolutely something to take into account. And then I believe you said something about the local level, and I absolutely agree with you. The local level is where everything happens. It's what is the closest to the citizens. It's also what's the most visible and the most the most impactful, I think. So I think, yeah, it's of course nice to talk about the national level, but in many countries where the national level is difficult electorally and democratically, the local level is doing amazing things. So I think that's where we really have to look.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Do you want me to go over the response, or we can move to your next question?
Non, c'est bon pour moi.
D'accord, parfait. Donc, malheureusement, so Flavio, we're really sorry. We'll have to ask you to wait and ask your question at the second Q&A session, because we need to move the second panel for today. But we can, of course, come back to these questions later on. Yep. Thank you. So we are moving now indeed to our second panel, and it will be on the theme African Democratic Innovations, Practices, and Experience. So this panel promises to be an enriching exploration of the dynamic and involving democratic practices across Africa. So we have three distinguished speakers who will share their insight and experience on democratic innovations in Ghana, South Africa, and Morocco. So this time our Q&A session will be at the end of the panel, so please hold your question until all speakers have presented. So our first presentation comes from Professor Jasper Ayala Zunu, an associate professor of political science at the University of Development Studies in Ghana. Professor Ayala Zunu is a critical social scientist dedicated to using research and knowledge to promote the well-being of subaltern classes worldwide. His extensive research encompasses poverty, human development, governance, elections, civic activism, and international relations. Before joining academia, he gained valuable experience working with the government of Ghana and United Nations missions in Bosnia and Kosovo. Today, he will share his insights on citizen engagement in Ghana. So please welcome Professor Jasper Ayala Zunu. We are really looking forward to hearing more on this topic.
Thank you, Magdalene. Thanks for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. And thanks for the invitation. And it's nice to meet everybody here on this platform. Can I share my screen, please?
Yes, of course.
The topic of my speech, as I'm unable to share it, is titled Saving True Democracy, Musing about the Civic Role of the University. On this, I want to situate it within the context of Ghana and the democracy that has been the experience of Ghanaians with this specific form of democracy, which is liberal democracy. So the purpose of my presentation or the argument is that the liberal democracy or the liberal model of democracy that is practiced across the world is a caricature of true democracy. It is a bastardization of what I will conceptualize as true democracy. As such, I argue that universities, by their privileged positions and by their historical role, should play a civic role in saving this true democracy, as I will try to define later on. So I'm here proposing that the university should play an active civic role to save true democracy in the form of participatory democracy. So the suggestion here is that democratic innovations should revolve around the university and its role as a civic organization. So that's my argument. And then I try to, by saying that true democracy, one will be asking, what is true democracy? So this will take me to conceptual issues, because by saying true democracy, you offer yourself to criticisms for people to ask what is really true democracy. On this, I want to simply suggest that democracy, even though, presently, when they talk of democracy, it is presumed that democracy is just one model of democracy. Of course, I'm sure the participants of this webinar are aware that democracy is more than just liberal democracy. But for us in Ghana, when they talk about democracy, it's just about electoral democracy in its liberal form. And this, I will argue, is not the true democracy that I'm talking of. This liberal form of democracy is actually a specific form of democracy that does not actually address the key meaning of democracy, or it departs or deviates from the key meaning of democracy, which is that democracy is ruled by the people, which means that the people must actually be seen to be the masters, and then political leaders will be the servants. This will be the ideal true democracy, which then means that we are here talking about direct democracy, participatory democracy, democracy that is pure in the sense that it is about the people and not about the elites. So this then means that one has to draw a distinction between what the likes of Adam Prewonsky term as a very narrow or minimal definition of democracy, which is just about elections. Adam Prewonsky thinks that democracy in its minimalist form is a system of government in which parties lose elections. In that sense, he thinks that the purpose of democracy is just about preventing people from killing each other, in the sense that as they struggle for power, it can lead to conflict, and a bloody one of that, like that. And for that matter, it can lead to people killing each other. But if it is about elections agreed on certain terms, it then will solve that problem. So this is what he thinks is the minimal definition of democracy, and that is in line with Joseph Schumpeter's competitive elitism, which is mostly about just elites competing to win elections. I will think that that is not the true democracy. The true democracy is the democracy in which the people, even though with our modern complex societies, cannot participate directly in democracy, and for that matter, they vote and elect people. But in this case, those that they vote must be accountable in the true sense to the people. But unfortunately, democracy in the present time has moved away from this true participatory democracy, in the sense that when voted into power, we have a system where the elites just compete for votes. In the case of Ghana, it's about two dominant parties, the National Democratic Congress and the New Patriotic Party. These are the two dominant parties that rotate powers among themselves. In the case of Ghana, it's a clear case of competitive elitism, where the political class of these two parties, the NDC and the NPP, compete, win elections, rotate power between each other, and then they go to Accra, and then Accra is the capital city of Ghana, where the seat of government is, the parliament is, and then they forget about the people. Yet, Ghana is presented as a model democracy because of this competitive elitism. Over the past 30 years, Ghana has held elections and rotated power. So because of that, those who define democracy in this narrow form consider Ghana as a model democracy. But this is not the true democracy that Ghanaians struggle for. There's one Ghanaian political scientist called F.K. Dra. He argued that when the masses were struggling for democracy several years ago in Ghana in the 1980s, they were actually struggling for true participatory social democratic government. There is also another very prominent political scientist, a Nigerian political scientist, Claude Ake, who argues that the struggle for democracy in Africa and in the true sense of the African knowledge, traditional or indigenous system of governance, they were struggling for democracy that is not just limited to the political domain, but democracy that extends to the economic domain. So for Africans, there's no separation between the economic and the political. They are joined. Actually, a lot of things are joined in Africa. When people in Africa talk about certain phenomena, they try not to distinguish between different domains. In fact, the spiritual and the worldly domains are connected. The same thing applies to economic and the political spheres of life. So they argue that you cannot draw a distinction between economic and the political. And for that matter, you democratize the political sphere and leave the economic sphere. But what we have in Ghana is truly a liberal democracy where there's a separation between the political domain and the economic domain. And this might be the case across the world where you have democracy, people queue to vote as equals, political equals. But at the end of the day, there's huge inequality, atrocious inequality, poverty that is seen all over the place. And by the way, this competitive democratic system in Ghana has led to corruption, vote buying, what people are beginning to describe as monocracy. There is and this is leading to a situation where a lot of Ghanaians do not believe in democracy again. They are not satisfied with democracy. A recent survey by Afrobarometer found out that 9 in every 10 Ghanaians believe that the country is heading in the wrong direction because of this narrow, minimalist notion of democracy. And they found out that there's massive decline in the satisfaction with the democracy that is practiced in Ghana. Only 51% of Ghanaians surveyed were satisfied. And this is a steep decline from 74% who were satisfied in 2011. So we have a situation in Ghana where the true participatory social democratic governance is no more what exists in Ghana. If it ever existed, I think I'll argue that it never existed. It has been liberal democracy. So based on this background or situated in this background, how can universities come in to play a role as civic organizations? And in this case, I'm arguing that democratic innovations should revolve around universities as unique organizations, as institutions that are privileged in the sense that by their nature, they have this privilege of speaking truth to power. By their nature, universities are supposed to be incubators of the political elites, incubators of future leaders. They are supposed to be training citizens to be good democratic citizens. So here we are seeing universities as not just institutions for research and teaching generally, but in doing this, university must be seen to be taking into consideration the normative standards of knowledge creation, knowledge production, of teaching, which means that they must play a role by socializing students who are supposed to be future leaders to be critical, civic, active citizens who will hold their leaders accountable, not just belong to a party and support it blindly, as it happens in Ghana. Poor people are divided between NDC and NPP, educated people divided between NDC and NPP, even university lecturers these days are not the people who speak truth to power. So we have a situation where the academia is no more as active in speaking truth to power, in holding the state accountable. Most of the academics in Ghana are divided between NDC and NPP. The same thing applies to their students. So here, I'm calling for the civic role of a university, which will lead to a situation where universities reinvent or recover their original civic responsibilities. And here, the history of most universities in Europe, USA shows that they were actually originally supposed to be civic organization in terms of research, teaching, that is producing good citizens, good democratic citizens who will be active and very active in the political life of their states. So, but along the line, this civic role of universities somehow got lost as universities move further and further away from their communities, creating what they call the Ivory League, and for that matter, bringing into being the distinction between town and gone. Just focus on research and then teaching, which doesn't really go by these civic ideals. So what I am suggesting now is that universities can reinvent this role, this civic role. And to start with, I have designed a project which is about to take place in Ghana, which is in line with this civic role of the university. And the project is called UDS. My university is called University for Development Studies, in short, UDS. So we have designed this project called Democracy in Action Dialogues series at UDS. That's UDS. The plan or the concept is that UDS, in playing this civic role that I have described, will form a genuine town hall meeting or organize genuine town hall meetings and call both top public servants and top politicians like members of parliament, presidential and vice presidential candidates to appear in a very well-organized, genuine town hall setting in which ordinary people, not elites like me, not lecturers, but ordinary people like the students, the UDS community, which includes the local communities, farmers, peasants, chiefs, will come to this authentic town hall meeting in which they will pose questions to these leaders appearing. I ask them questions about their mandate, how they are using their mandate, ask them questions about their policies, basically holding them accountable in the literal sense of political accountability. And that's why we call it Democracy in Action Dialogue Series. That's UDS. Going forward, we have already, this has been approved by the university, and we have sent letters to the two dominant parties that are contesting for the elections this year. We are inviting the vice presidential candidates, we are inviting the presidential candidates to appear on this platform of the UDS. So, and then to take questions, answer questions, explain to the people about their manifestos, about their programs. The people will get a chance to ask them questions. So this is what I would term an authentic open forum, authentic town hall meeting, call it whatever you may, but this is in line with deliberative democracy, a form of innovation, but this innovation revolves around the university as an institution that produces the human resource of the country, an institution that produces most of the leaders that are in Ghana, the parliament, in the presidency are all have passed through the university. So the university has this cloud, this influence to actually play this innovative role to save genuine democracy, to save participatory democracy from its decline, in fact, from its demise. So this is one of the innovations, the democratic innovation that, based on my experience in working in Ghana as a political scientist, working in Ghana in the public service, this is one of those innovations I think can actually, save true and participatory democracy. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Ayla Zuno. We really learned a lot from this inspiring presentation. So a brief summary in French for our French speakers. La question qui intéressait notre panéliste dans cette présentation, c'est bien déjà c'est quoi la vraie démocratie et comment on peut aller vers une démocratie réelle et pas seulement le modèle libéral dont on a l'habitude. Donc, démocratie, ça ne devrait pas être seulement une question d'avoir des élections, mais originellement, c'est supposé être un contrôle par le peuple, que le peuple est en mesure de prendre des décisions, que le peuple peut avoir sa voix véritablement représentée ou capable d'influencer les politiques. Mais la démocratie, c'est un peu détaché de, on va dire, de cette mission initiale et que maintenant on a, par exemple, au Ghana, il a parlé d'un système d'élitisme compétitif où il y a deux partis dominants qui se partagent le pouvoir et qui ne rendent pas des comptes à la population. Donc, la solution qui a été proposée, c'est bien d'avoir les universités, que l'université doit jouer un rôle civique, l'université en tant qu'institution qui a une voix influente, qui peut être entendue par les décideurs politiques, mais qui forme également les citoyens et les leaders de demain. L'université a un rôle important à jouer pour nous aider à aller vers une véritable démocratie. Donc, la solution, l'innovation qui est proposée par professeur Ayla Zuno, c'est d'instaurer un projet de démocratie en action où ils vont inviter des leaders de ces deux partis dominants et avoir les citoyens, donc tout le monde, les chefs et les citoyens, les simples citoyens, on va dire, où ils peuvent se rassembler et rencontrer ces leaders-là et leur poser des questions par rapport à leur programme. Ce serait une façon, on va dire, de les forcer à rendre des comptes pour les décisions politiques qu'ils prennent. Donc, c'est un mécanisme qui peut vraiment permettre d'aller vers une démocratie véritablement délibérative, véritablement participative. Merci beaucoup, professeur Ayla Zuno. Thank you for this presentation. We will move to our next panelist. And of course, save your questions. And I've also seen some questions in the chat. We will be asking them at the end of the panel. So we're moving now to our second speaker for today. So next we have Kira Alberts and Damien Dupress, both associated with the Center for Research and Democracy, CREDO, at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Kira Alberts is a research associate at CREDO and a master's candidate in political science. Her research focuses on information disorder, democratic resilience, and innovation in Africa. She co-chairs the newly established Citizens Assembly Working Group. Damien Dupress is a research coordinator at CREDO and the co-chair of the Citizens Assembly Working Group, the first such research initiative on the African continent. His interests include democratic innovation, the climate crisis, and governance beyond the state. Together, they will present on the challenges and opportunities for Citizens Assembly in South Africa. But please welcome our two speakers for today's discussion on the challenges and opportunities for citizens' assemblies in South Africa.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I should start by giving my apologies to my colleague Damien. He had a last-minute crisis, so I will be handling the presentation on behalf of us both. So if you could just allow me to share my screen for a moment. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the other esteemed panelists. I've been absolutely in awe of all of the information we've received today. So for my presentation, or our presentation, I should rather say, I will speak on the challenges and opportunities for citizens' assemblies in South Africa. So after we've heard a lot today about the types of deliberative practices and participatory practices, our presentation will speak a bit more on the process and the thinking behind getting a practice like this going, especially in a context in which the practice is relatively new. So, firstly, just a little bit on our project as a bit of background, and then I'll continue to tackle the challenges and opportunities respectively. So the Citizens Assembly Working Group was convened by the Centre for Research on Democracy at Stellenbosch University as a research project directed to one key question. To what extent is the deliberative democratic process known as a Citizens Assembly relevant to and suitable for South African democracy as well as the broader African context? In pursuit of this, the working group will co-design, convene, and evaluate the first Citizens' Assembly in South Africa in cooperation with some of our local partners. We are still very much in the thinking and research phase of our project and have been quite intentional in how we went about this. Because we simply didn't want to copy and paste a practice into a context that is much different than the context it was originally designed for and practiced in. So citizens' assemblies have been widely used in Europe and Australia. We've heard, as some of our panelists have said today, but hasn't really been practiced that much in the context of the Global South and specifically South Africa. And I'll speak a little bit later on what exactly that means. But for us, as a starting step, it meant that we're not just going to take this practice and parachute it into a different context. We wanted to be very intentional about how we did that. We wanted to know about local practices and challenges that would inform our design, and took that part up as a part of our research. So to see what deliberative practices already exist in our context, what of those practices look similar perhaps to citizens' assemblies, or what are existing deliberative practices that might just be called something else? Because sometimes we see in our context specifically that we have very many deliberative practices, but nobody really identifies them as such. So we wanted to really put in that research effort to see what those practices are and how we can learn from them. So before I get into the actual findings of our preliminary research, I just want to give a broad idea for those who might not be familiar with the concept of a citizens' assembly. So a citizens' assembly consists of a representative group of lay citizens who are randomly selected and gathered together over several days to learn about, deliberate on, and put forward recommendations for a policy issue affecting their community. In most cases, participants are guided through the process by trained facilitators who help ensure quality of deliberation and subject experts who teach citizens about the issue at hand. Okay, so very broad overview. Again, if there are questions on exactly details and about the sortition and selection process, I would be happy to answer those in the comment section. So firstly, to look at some of the challenges that we are facing. First is the tension between neo-colonial interference and the glorification of local experiences. So we don't want to exceptionalize the South African context to such an extreme that we close ourselves off from learning from others. But as I said, we also don't want to parachute in a developed idea into a brand new context. What is required of this project is the translation and transformation of taking the idea of citizens' assemblies as developed in the North, marrying it with existing democratic practices in the South, and developing a new context-appropriate practice. So that I sort of spoke about in the introduction as well. The second big challenge that we face is multidimensional inequality we see in South Africa and how that will affect deliberation in a CA. So South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. Extremely high inequality defines incomes, education, housing, childcare, transport, healthcare, and so many other spheres of life in our country. So convening a citizens' assembly in this context means bringing together a group of people reflecting these extreme inequalities. So you may very well have a highly paid lawyer engaging in the same issue as a manual laborer with poor literacy and little to no formal education. And we need to make sure that we create an environment that is equally representative, equally welcoming, and gives equal opportunities to all of the participants. Add into this also multilingualism, patriarchal cultural practices, racial tensions as a result of unaddressed divisions from apartheid, and an increasingly antagonistic populist politics that have come to the forefront. We are facing a really complicated and complex context in which to bring in this practice. So a part of our research will go into studying how deliberation unfolds in these contexts and how we can design our citizens' assembly in accordance with our findings. Then a third challenge we face is capture by political elites. In South Africa, our institutions and state enterprises have a habit of either being captured or castrated by political elites. There is also a fair amount of suspicion towards academics and politicians more generally, and citizens' assemblies whose recommendations can often challenge the status quo and elevate voices of marginalized communities would likely be the target for outright political capture, who see, or from politicians who see this as a direct threat to their political position. Capture may also be less severe than this, with the citizens' assembly simply being used as window dressing for already agreed on policy positions. So a part of our work will also go into exploring the involvement of NGO partners, civil society groups, and communities themselves, and also communities who already practice deliberative democracy in their own right, which a later part of my presentation will look at, and how we can include those partners in the oversight, topic selection, design process, evaluation, and even the follow-up in order to guard against political capture. So we really want as much involvement as possible. So essentially, if I can put it like this, we want to emphasize bottom-up design to protect from distortion from top down. All right. So that was quite a mouthful, and it's not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that we're dealing with and thinking as we enter the design process for our citizens' assembly. And overall, although this seems quite overwhelming, and certainly when we started the project, it did to us, but in South Africa, we really have the opportunity to test a very promising democratic innovation in a uniquely challenging context. And therefore, we believe it will enhance the process and elevate citizens' assemblies to the next level. So with that topic of more opportunities, I'll speak about some of the opportunities we've also seen in the South African context. So firstly is the fact that the South African Constitution lays a really robust foundation for public participation. And with that legislation comes, with the Constitution comes a really robust legislative framework. And with that, it is complemented obviously by institutions dedicated to promoting public participation. So that's a great starting point for us. But unfortunately, many of this legislation and bodies have been criticized for being tokenistic. So we need to look at where the failings are there and see how citizens' assemblies can complement or fill in. So in this sort of challenge that our landscape faces, citizens' assemblies offer an opportunity. And then speaking about our existing practices, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of deliberative practices already in South Africa that we can learn from. Some of them include traditional authorities and community councils that seek to directly connect traditional leaders within certain tribes within South Africa, connecting them directly to their provincial and regional leaders. And that's a deliberation process that happens between these two parties and then also within the traditional communities as they seek to communicate their needs directly to regional leaders. Then we have something called an imbizo, which means, or which translates to the gathering to share knowledge. And that's exactly what it is. It is a practice that we see where it links, again, political leaders and community members in order for them to communicate certain issues that they see in their communities and how it can be addressed. Then quite similar to this is amakomiti, which means community meetings. And these are known as grassroots democracy in shack settlements. Trevor Ngwane wrote a beautiful book on this and conducted a study in dozens of South African shack settlements that he found shack dwellers, communities that often committees, that govern local life are responsible for the popular needs and provide the voice for the community. These committees, called amakomiti in the Zulu language, organize the provision of basic services such as water, sanitation, public works, and crime prevention. So this is where they really step in and fulfill a role that the government fails to meet. And in a very informal way, they step in and sort of create this deliberative and participatory community. And partnering with these communities and learning from the leaders in these communities, we can gain a lot in our citizens' assemblies. And then other practices that also exist is sectoral parliaments and community policing forums, which I'll not go into a lot of detail, but essentially these are practices and forms of deliberation that have organized quite informally, but have proven to be very successful at meeting community needs. And then the last opportunity I'll speak on before I go way too far over time is the South African political climate itself as an opportunity. Over the last 30 years, we've been under the majority rule of the ANC, with the 2024 elections bringing change, and we see the government of national unity stepping in. So we're really entering a stage of reinvention and reinvigoration within the South African democracy. And we see this as an opportunity for citizens' assemblies to be a part of this reinvigoration. So I'll leave that there. Again, I'm open to any questions and would be happy to send the full presentation if you want details on any of this. And thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure engaging.
Thank you so much, Kira, for this presentation. This is a really fascinating research, and we're really looking forward to find out like the final outcome. En bref, Kira a expliqué qu'elle travaille sur un projet de recherche avec un autre collègue et qu'ils essayaient de répondre à la question de savoir dans quelle mesure l'initiative des assemblées de citoyens est adaptée au contexte sud-africain et plus largement africain. Donc, pour eux, c'était crucial de ne pas simplement importer un modèle qui vient d'un contexte étranger pour l'appliquer dans le contexte sud-africain, mais de voir comment on peut aller voir les processus délibératifs locaux et voir quelles possibilités et défis également qu'il y aurait pour répliquer ou vraiment développer un système d'assemblée de citoyens en Afrique du Sud. Donc, pour le moment, ils ont déjà des résultats pour leurs recherches préliminaires et ces recherches montrent que ces assemblées de citoyens, qui déjà une première définition, c'est que ce sont des assemblées où les gens peuvent se rencontrer et décider et, on va dire, exprimer leur opinion et faire des recommandations sur des sujets d'actualité publique. Ils sont généralement aidés par des facilitateurs qui les accompagnent pour comprendre le problème qui se présente et sur lequel ils doivent prendre des décisions. Et dans le contexte de l'Afrique du Sud, il y a un bon nombre de difficultés, qu'il s'agisse de l'héritage néocolonial ou de la pauvreté et des inégalités qui sont très présentes dans tous les aspects de la vie dans ce pays-là. Et il y a d'autres défis comme le multilinguisme, des questions de genre et des tensions raciales également. Donc, c'est un contexte qui est très complexe et il faudra voir comment adapter ces assemblées à la situation et au contexte qui existe. Mais il y a quand même des opportunités parce qu'il y a une constitution de l'Afrique du Sud qui encourage ces procédures délibératives. Il y a également énormément de formes de participation locale, de délibération locale qui peuvent servir d'inspiration. Et le contexte politique actuel est également encourageant parce qu'il y a eu un changement de parti élu aux dernières élections. Donc, c'est quand même une porte qui s'ouvre pour penser à des renouvellements politiques et au niveau de la démocratie. Thank you, Kira, for the questions, and we'll go back to you later on for the Q&A sessions. We have one last presentation, and I really want to apologize to everyone as we're supposed to end at 12, but we will briefly go over our last presentation and hopefully answer some of your questions. Thank you so much for your patience. So our final speaker for this second panel is Fatima Zamba. So Fatima's expertise lies at the intersection of collective intelligence facilitation and deliberative democracy. She has served as a cluster facilitator for the Global Assembly on Climate and Ecological Crisis and is a junior project manager in public innovation at the School of Collective Intelligence in Morocco. Her work focuses on experimental methods to enhance deliberation practices and promote citizen engagement. Today, Fatima will share her perspective on collective intelligence in Morocco. Thank you so much, Fatima, for being here. We're really happy to have you, and thank you for your patience. It's to you now. We are ready to listen to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Magdali. I joined the webinar late. Unfortunately, I missed half of the presentations from the first panel, but I'm glad to be here. I learned a lot from you today. And by the way, impressive job, Magdali, translating and summarizing all of the contributions of the panelists. Very impressive. I will try to share my screen. If it doesn't work for me either, then I'll have to just...
Okay. Yes, yeah, you can.
So in the next 15 minutes, I want to talk to you about why groups are almost always better at tasks of deliberation, creative tasks, problem solving, policy making, beyond questions of legitimacy and of trust. Why should we include citizens in policy making? What are the dynamics that lie behind group work? What makes a group more intelligent than the sum of its individuals? And then I want to briefly introduce to you a collective intelligence case study from Morocco. And this is a very historical unprecedented initiative that was launched back in 2018 by the King Mohammed VI in Morocco, where he instructed a group of people to harness the collective intelligence of Moroccans to build a new model for development that is made by Moroccans for Moroccans. To do so, I want to take you back first in time and place to 1906 to West England, more particularly to the Polymouth town, where people would usually hold their annual fat stock and poultry fair. And I want to take you to that particular day where a guy under the name of Francis Galton, he's a very famous and renowned statistician, mathematician, who happens to be the half cousin of Charles Darwin. So one might imagine that Francis is also very obsessed with questions of breeding and eugenics. Breeding was so important for Francis Galton because he believed that only very few people had the characteristics necessary to keep societies healthy. He, in fact, devoted his entire career to measuring those characteristics. He had an entire lab to measure these characteristics and to identify what characteristics make good people for the health of society. And most of his experiments only proved to him that the majority of people did not really have these characteristics. And therefore, he believed and he said, only if power and control stayed in the hands of the select, the well-bred few, Galton believed that this would make society remain healthy and strong. Little did he know that that trip that he had in 1906 to that fat stock and poultry fair would change the course of history and would change the way he perceived citizen intelligence and expertise. Galton walked around the fair where there was a farmer who held the competition for the visitors of that fair. And the farmer asked the crowd, there were about 800 people, 780 to 800 people that day at that exact competition. The farmer asked the crowd to predict the weight of a cow or an ox. After the ox is slaughtered and prepared, he asked the people to guess and to bid on the weight of the ox. And whoever wins the bid will be rewarded a piece of cheese. So basically, a lot of people were motivated, a lot of people contributed, a lot of people made a bid on the weight of the ox. And Francis Galton was there watching from far. Somebody ended up getting the right weight of the ox, and he won the piece of cheese. But Francis was not interested in the crowd bidding, was not interested in that piece of cheese. He was interested in that box where the farmer would put the bids that he takes from the people and put them in that particular box. Now, each ticket would usually have the guess and the bid of the person and their name. What Francis Galton did is he went to that farmer and asked him if he can keep that box with all of those guesses. Francis is a statistician. He is crazy about numbers, and he, would ran experiments and ran tests all the time. He felt that there was something interesting about that box of tickets, so he took it back home with him. And he ran a series of statistical tests, and one of them was to average all of the bets that the people made. He went back home and he averaged all of them. And to his surprise, the crowd prediction, which was the average of all of the weights that people guessed, was super close to the actual weight of the ox, almost only 1 pound away from the actual weight. And he noticed that the crowd was actually more accurate than the person who ended up winning that piece of cheese. That person was so close to the actual weight, but not as close as the crowd prediction. Francis knew that he discovered something that was really interesting. As he was running his experiment, he also noticed that the more he would add, because he created an entire spreadsheet with all of these guesses, and as he would average, the more tickets and the more guesses he would add to his pool, the pool that he was analyzing, the less the error would appear, meaning that the crowd was less wrong the more you add guesses, the less the crowd was wrong. And Francis Galton at that time realized that he discovered something very interesting, that James Sorofsky, almost 100 years later, would call the crowd the wisdom of the crowd. Now, James Sorofsky explains that the crowd was able to find the accurate number or weight of the ox because it did fulfill a lot of conditions. James Sorofsky believes that for tasks like prediction, like creativity, like problem solving, collective intelligence or crowd wisdom is not a phenomenon that just happens in nature just like that. It needs a lot of conditions. It needs a lot of facilitation. James Zarofsky explains that that crowd was able to find the accurate number because they had access to decentralized information. Decentralized information could mean there was an old man at that crowd who had a very heavy car. And for them to decide the weight of the cow, the old man said, well, my car is 2,000 pounds, it's 2,000 pounds. That cow should be half the weight of my car. So that cow should be around 1,000. A child would say, I have a puppy that is almost 10 pounds, 10 pounds. And I guess that the cow will be 10 times the weight of my puppy. So these people had a decentralized access to information, meaning that these people they'd drawn from their own personal experiences. They had that citizen expertise in a way or another. From their lived experiences, they were able to have access to decentralized information. And when you take the guess of that old man who referred to his car with the guess of that child who referred to his puppy, errors cancel each other. So the more people you have who have more access to decentralized information that is directly drawn from their own personal experiences, the less error you have when you have more people. Also, cognitive diversity, and this is very different from decentralized information. Cognitive diversity refers to our ways of thinking. We all think differently. We all have different cognitive processes in our brains, and that helps and contributes greatly to our collective intelligence. Independent judgment, it is also a very crucial condition that made that crowd make the accurate judgment, because people would write down their guess on a piece of paper without being influenced by other people around them. In effective aggregation, the farmer would take all of these beds, and he would make sure that no idea is lost, meaning no bed is lost, and make sure to aggregate all of them. And this is what Francis has done. He aggregated all of these contributions and inputs from people, and was able at the very end to find out that people were more accurate than individuals. Now, these are the four main conditions to the crowd wisdom or collective intelligence. But of course, after James Zarofsky, a lot of other scientists and I would say researchers and practitioners from all around the globe are now dedicating a huge part of their time just to understand what are the conditions that make groups more intelligent. And by collective intelligence, I mean the ability of groups to surpass the capacity of its individuals in tasks like problem solving, like prediction, like we just saw with the cow, creativity tasks. It's also a scientific field, as I said, that studies the conditions of collective intelligence, not only the conditions, but also ways in which humans can augment their collective intelligence. Now with AI happening, now with all of the things happening right now with in the world, technology and AI, how can we make use of technology to augment our collective intelligence? We can imagine mass deliberation tools that would help and allow humans to have mass discussions and mass deliberations in a way that would help them help their collective intelligence emerge. Now the drivers of collective intelligence, I've only mentioned four, but also, again, of course, even if you have a group of people with a very decentralized information, cognitive diversity, independence of judgment, motivation to share, it is not enough. Collective intelligence needs facilitation. So you need facilitators who will help make sure that no voice will be unheard. We'll make sure to facilitate the energy in the room and to get everyone to speak. You also need the tools. You also need spaces. It's an entire field. And, the phenomena of collective intelligence does not emerge just like that. It really needs organization. It needs a lot of conditions. If you're interested in learning more about collective intelligence, I'm happy to drop a couple of references for you to look at. In the next section of my talk, I want to talk about a very unprecedented and historical collective intelligence initiative that is really dear to my heart that just happened very lately in 2018, which is the Special Commission on the Development Model, CSMD. So what happened back in 2018 is that the King of Morocco wanted to build a new development model for the country. And to do so, he wanted it to be very participatory and co-constructed with the citizens themselves. He wanted to build a vision for Morocco, a vision that was, built with the citizens and with the different stakeholders. So what he did is he instructed a group of 35 people to build this entire initiative and lead it. But these are not your usual group of people. They're not politicians. These are not ministers. These people have nothing to do with government. These are people who excel in their respective fields. 35 people, most of them are some of them are authors, some of them are postdoc researchers in renewable energy, others are crowdfunding experts. I've had so many of them teaching me a couple of courses a couple of years ago. So seeing how the king is delegating this task of building a collective intelligence model for Moroccans to build this new development model, and he's not mandating politicians or people from the government, but people from all walks of life, people just like us, but happen to be experts in their fields. And, most of them have dedicated most of their lives serving this country. So as I said, the king really wanted to build a common vision and a shared vision for all Moroccans to create a new approach centered on meeting the needs of citizens. Our new development model, we don't want it to be, inspired from other countries abroad, but we want it to really reflect and mirror our needs as Moroccans. So how did the CSMD design their collective intelligence model? It all happened and started back in 2019, where the commission met for the very first time in Vingrid, and the president of the commission, who was a former minister, said, how can we make collective intelligence guide all of the aspects of our work? How will that really, what does it mean in practice? And so first of all, they worked on their own internal processes of collective intelligence. Now, bear in mind, these people come from diverse backgrounds, right? And most of them are experts in their fields. They're overachievers. Every single Moroccan know every single person of this commission because they're very famous in their field. They've served the country. So how are you going to get 35 people in one room to work together, knowing that they have strong personalities, they're overachievers, they're all experts in their fields? How are you going to make sure that all of the voices are equal? So they had a lot of work internally to design their own collective intelligence processes. How are they going to facilitate conversations? How are they going to make sure that no voice will be lost? So I remember, because they were in our university, so I remember them being in this intensive program on that trained them on the basics of collective intelligence and how to make sure that they themselves internally work in a very collective, intelligent way. And then this, when it comes to the internal processes and then the external processes, and that is, how are we going to draw from the citizen expertise of citizens to build this model with them that would reflect their needs? So all of them agreed, and it was obvious to them that they needed to do national consultations all over Morocco. And this national consultation was very unprecedented in the history of Morocco. A lot of initiatives that happened in Morocco beforehand only focused on a couple of regions. Now, this one was a national consultation, and they tried to reach people in rural areas, people who could not read and write, people who are usually not even asked their opinions, the voices that are unheard. So they made sure that their approach is very inclusive. So they adopted a hybrid multi-stakeholder / participatory approach that was completed by an internal deliberation, meaning that they would take the input from all citizens, from all stakeholders, and they would add that to their own way of seeing things, because they were mandated by the king because of their expertise in their fields. So they also made sure that their voices are also heard in the middle of all the voices that they tried to hear throughout the entire process, that, by the way, lasted 12 months, almost a year. So they built multiple channels to maximize diversity and scale. And this would be stakeholder hearings where they invited political parties and unions to hear them out, hear their concerns. What are the key areas that they want to prioritize in the new development model? They also had working sessions with national and international domain experts in certain fields. They also had citizen meetings that were planned for each of Morocco's 12 regions, meaning that there was no region left. In each region, they would choose they would launch a call to participation for people, and they would pick 30 to 60 citizens to hear them out and have a deliberation session with them. And the reason why they opted for self-selected people rather than randomization. And one of the reports that I ended up reading very lately, they say that that was a very strategic choice, and because Morocco is different. And if randomization works abroad, it might not work in Morocco, because a lot of people would perceive that this is a threat to legitimacy. A lot of people would think that those people who were randomly selected were actually people who were deliberately selected to manipulate, policymaking. Maybe they wanted those particular people to be there for other voices not to be heard. So they made sure to, adapt whatever processes they were working with to the local realities of Morocco, because Morocco and Africa are different, and each context has its own characteristics. They also had listening sessions with local associations, but also an online platform. And this online platform was to capture all of the voices of the people who couldn't be part of the in-person sessions, because it was limited to 30 to 60, and again it was because of the constraints of the logistics. They couldn't really host more than 60 people. The people who couldn't be there had the chance to give their input online through a portal that was called CSM Déploiement, and every single Moroccan who had a proposition, something to say, will be able to go there and input all of their and give all their inputs. They also had field visits. They went and visited people in rural areas, in towns, and literally the middle of nowhere. They tried to reach as many people as they can, making sure that all the voices are heard. They also had a call to contribution, meaning that if you are interested in writing to them, with one of your propositions, if you don't want to go necessarily through the CSM Déploiement platform, you can just write to them. And also free contributions from, organizations who are interested in making their voice heard. So through a series of deliberations, hearing sessions, they really try to make sure that all of the voices are heard, and that people's needs are mirrored in whatever recommendations they were about to give to the king. And that is a detail I forgot to say. The CSMD Commission was tasked with giving recommendations to the king, and the king would receive these recommendations that would then be translated into policy making. So they did not have a legally binding, I would say, right? Their recommendations were not legally binding. They were just, recommendations that would help shape policy making and the vision for the future for Morocco. Now, what were the main outcomes of the work of CSMD? So they received over 10,000 written pages of contributions from 6,000 individuals and 165 organizations through organized consultations. They also interacted directly with more than 9,700 individuals. They've also hired teams from the University of Mohammed VI Polytechnic, as well as another university, where they hired a couple of experts to use LLMs in language models to make sure that no idea will get lost. The ideas that were contributed online, so the LLMs will just cluster ideas and give them the summary of what people who contributed online really thought. But again, and this is these are the two major areas of concern that were prioritized during the discussions that the commission had with the citizens. And this is something you would hear every time whenever somebody would tell a story. A lot of people were really frustrated with what they called a broken social ladder, meaning that people who live in rural areas suffer immensely because they don't have access to infrastructure, they don't have access to quality education. And when they were in my university 5 years ago, a lot of people shared the same stories. So we were happy to see that the CSMD Commission took this into consideration and build its recommendations around helping people in rural areas have more access to infrastructure and quality education. Another thing was public administration. And if you're a Moroccan, then this is a fact. Public administration in Morocco and public services are not, we're not really satisfied with the quality of public services. So this is also one of the main topics that emerged from the online consultations and the consultations they had with people in person. So what happened after this phase is the system, they did their own retreat. They made sure to include everyone's proposals and everyone's concerns, and they drafted an entire report that they sent to the king. They presented it to the king. It was, aired on national TV, where all Moroccans saw our new vision for 2035. And the key areas of the recommendations that the CSMD Commission gave, they built a vision for 2035 where they see Morocco doubling its GDP. They see Morocco by 2035 increasing by 90% the level of literacy in kids, especially the ones living in rural areas. Again, public administration, they wanted more than 80% satisfaction for Moroccans when it comes to the public services. I'm aware that I should probably stop here. Maybe I can keep talking whenever more questions come. But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about the work of CSMD, again, I'm happy to drop a couple of resources online. But thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Fatima. That was a brilliant presentation, and we really appreciate the insights into the different research that has been done. And it's a very innovative project. Brièvement, la présentation de Fatima adressait la question de savoir pourquoi un groupe est toujours mieux que les individus. Donc, on peut avoir de meilleures performances à travers un groupe que l'on pourrait avoir avec de simples individus, parce qu'il y a une sorte d'intelligence collective qui se met en place quand un groupe de personnes est rassemblé pour résoudre des problèmes quand les circonstances, on va dire, sont favorables pour permettre à cela de se produire. Donc, elle a présenté un nombre de recherches qui ont été performées sur cette question de la sagesse des foules et comment quand des conditions comme avoir une source d'information décentralisée, la diversité cognitive, le jugement indépendant et des moyens de réaliser une agrégation efficace, que ces différents mécanismes sont en place, donc les foules, on va dire, le groupe peut réaliser beaucoup mieux que ce qu'un individu serait capable de faire. Et un exemple pratique de cela est bien ce projet qui est en cours au Maroc. Donc, elle a parlé du CSMD, qui est la Commission spéciale sur le modèle de développement. Donc, c'était une initiative du roi qui voulait donc créer une intelligence collective pour Morocco pour définir la vision du Maroc pour les années à venir. Donc, il a fait appel à des experts, donc 35 personnes de différents domaines, des auteurs, des chercheurs, des experts en financement participatif qui ont été rassemblés pour un peu mener cette discussion et parvenir à développer cette vision pour le Maroc. Donc déjà, pour réaliser cette intelligence collective au niveau de leur groupe, ils ont dû voir comment travailler entre eux et comment être sûr que 35 personnes avec des personnalités fortes et une grande ambition peuvent arriver à collaborer ensemble. Donc, ils ont fait un travail déjà au niveau du groupe et après, par des mécanismes comme des rencontres avec des différents acteurs, des rencontres de citoyens, ils ont pu obtenir des suggestions, des propositions de la part des gens. Donc, en total, ils ont 10 000 pages écrites de contributions qui a été venue quand même et qu'ils ont pu agréger pour aller vers le roi avec leurs recommandations et une vision pour l'année 2035 avec un Maroc qui serait donc plus riche et qui ferait plus de place pour sa population rurale également. Donc, c'est un projet extrêmement intéressant et je suis sûre que vous avez beaucoup de questions pour Fatima. We again we really apologize for the time and thank you so much for all of those who stayed until now for our discussion. So we will move to the final Q&A session. So there were a lot of interesting questions in the chat, so I will start with them. But feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, and if we have time to also address them, we will do that for sure. Someone was asking, in the case of that project in South Africa, have your study considered indigenous or traditional community engagement practices and the use of relevant idioms, metaphors, cutting across different cultures to promote engagement and community assemblies? I'm adding the question in the chat as well, so you can refer to it. So the question is really in terms of how you localize in the study, like and involving indigenous views and practices.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the questions in the chat. So for this specific question, thank you so much. It's actually such a fantastic question. And we haven't really looked at idioms or metaphors specifically. So we welcome this type of input as we grow as we go. And this is still the research phase. So it's good that things like this come up. But as I said in my presentation, we really did and are looking at traditional community members and members who are or civil society organizations that are involved in these types of processes to come on board and to inform our processes and our design thinking. Towards the end of this year, we'll be having our first conference where these people from these communities all over South Africa will be brought into the loop, if I can say so, as we officially start the co-design process. So they will be involved, and I'm sure these types of questions and inputs will also come from their side to inform our process. So short answer, no. But we are trying actively to get as much involvement as possible and have as many voices heard and represented. And to the same effect, the topic of our Citizens Assembly has not yet been decided as we look to community members for them to express what are the most pressing needs, what is it that they want to deliberate, and that speaks briefly or broadly to John's question on why should citizens who have no passion for an issue to be forced to deliberate on it. So first part of that is, well, we ask the community what is it that they want, and then the second part of the answer there is that our selection process for participants in the Citizens Assembly is a two-part selection process, whereby first we send out invites on the basis of a citizen lottery, and then from those interested parties that reply back and say that they do want to be involved, we then choose from them a representative socio-demographic criteria. Based on that, we choose them to participate. So there is some sort of buy-in from the community and decision that they do want to partake in the deliberation. I'm sorry, I hope it's fine that I answered both questions, but I just thought they fed well into one another.
Thank you, Kira. I think this was a very insightful response, and I hope the person who asked it add their answer, and they can still comment if there's anything else that they want to clarify. So we also have a question for Dr. Ayala Zunum. So the question is that in the African context, what we notice the most is the organizations of elections in the cases of the Sahel countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, show that it is a context of insecurity. So in such a context, how can democratic values be safeguarded, especially when it's the very people who, through popular demonstrations, no longer recognize democratically elected power? I will put the question in the chat as well so that you can refer to it.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, the Sahel region, unfortunately, is facing what they call the reversal or decline of democracy recently, and something that is happening across the world. But in the case of the Sahel region, we are beginning to see a certain change or the upsurge of anti-democratic movements and revolts, military coup d'etats. So the question then is, how can democracy be practiced in that context? I think precisely because of the way liberal democracy has been shown to be too a bit undemocratic in the sense that it just focused on elections and then procedural rights and liberties. We are leaving the economic aspect. So there's huge inequality. And together with that, you have corruption and abuse of power. So it has led to people losing interest in democracy. I mean, they see democracy as more of an elite game. It's a dubious game in which the elites just go to power and then govern as if they have not been given the power by the people. And that has led to this support for coup d'etat, support for maybe some revolt groups, and then resistance from the bottom. But the other question is about, in the case of a conflict situation, what can be done? How can democracy be practiced? And again, that is also a problem because organizing elections within a conflict situation is a bit difficult, if not impossible. But the argument from the democratic peace theory is that once elections have been organized and they have been able to stabilize for some time, then democracy leads to peace and stability. And sometimes they use Ghana as an example because as a result of subsequent peaceful elections, the foundational elections, which are normally subject to conflict, Ghana has moved past that one and is at an advanced stage. So there's a sense in which electoral democracy is argued to be a form of bringing about peace and stability because people are able to organize, form parties, and then they vote peacefully for periodically, and for that matter, they exercise their democratic rights. But when it comes to a conflict situation or a post-conflict situation, then it's a different ball game because organizing elections immediately can actually exacerbate the conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this answer. We have another question from Sadi. You can open your microphone and ask it directly.
Hello, good evening. And thank you for the invitation. I'm Sadi from South Africa, and I just wanted to also engage, just to share, particularly with the participants that, and here in South Africa, the situation in Ghana and in other developing countries, we've got, for example, a robust a legal framework for local democratic and accountable governance, we also have institutionalized public participation mechanisms like ward committees, your integrated development planning processes, IMBIZOs, as Kira had mentioned. But these mechanisms have failed because they are highly politicized. And you'll find that in a community, it's only those that belong to a particular political party that would participate. So we have facilitated a research. I mean, we've done a research project where we looked at how we could use the asset-based approach as a citizen-led approach to promote people engagement, at the grassroots level, where you would organize people at the grassroots level, where they become co-researchers, co-contributors, co-designers of whatever plans that are developed at the grassroots level. But that has not really been implemented, but it was just a research. So I wanted to just say that I could share the results of that study, the outcome of that study. But perhaps to Kira, just to ask whether they have looked at the impact that the current GNU, the Government of National Unity, would have in terms of promoting people participation. Having said that, in the past, because of once, where you had, for example, the ruling party that is, dominating discussions without other people being engaged, do they see the Government of National Unity making some meaningful impact that actually also impact or and ensure that there is proper engagement and public participation? So I just wanted to check with Kira how they see that, but I can also share the outcome of the studies that we have done with the ICLD in Sweden. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tazi, for your contribution and question. Kira, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for your input, Sadi. I'd love to see the research outcomes. So please do share if it is possible. So in many ways, with the Government of National Unity, it is too early to tell. But from our perspective, at the both as the Citizen Assembly Working Group and as a Centre for Research on Democracy, we see it as an opportunity, and we are hopeful for what it could mean. Like I said in my presentation, we are entering a time of democratic reinvigoration in South Africa, and we envisage that citizens' assemblies would be a part of that. But it remains to be seen. Like you said, our public participation framework, although robust, it has so many faults and is just ineffective in many ways, due to how highly politicized it is, and how poorly it's actually run and operationalized. So we do hope to take a step towards making that better, but unfortunately, it is not a simple process, and it will take some time for us to see whether the GNU would be open to such suggestions, but also for us to get our own sort of participation ideas out there and our roadmap out there. As I said, we're taking a very sort of academic approach to becoming practitioners, and hopefully our pilot will only happen in 2026. So there's many steps in between the change actually happening, but we do hope it's on its way.
We have one final question that came online for Fatima. It is, how can the principles of collective intelligence be applied to other regions or countries facing similar social and political challenges as well?
Well, I think if Morocco learned anything from this collective intelligence initiative that they've done lately, was to always contextualize. There's really no model. It really, in every single practice that you want to implement, for example, when we were talking about randomization versus self-selection, you should be taking into consideration the local context of your own region. So now, if your question was around the basics like of collective intelligence, like questions of diversity, questions of decentralized information, now these are universal. You usually in a group need to make sure that you have these conditions that are favorable to the emergence of collective intelligence. You also need to take into consideration that in some cultures, for example, people tend to want to build consensus over having a debate or a deliberation, for example. In a group, there are some groups who tend to, some cultures, and it's embedded in their DNA, who tend to look for consensus, for example. Now, how do you design a collective intelligence process that makes sure that even if these people culturally tend to go for consensus, how do you make sure that all voices are still going to be equally heard and that the outcome will still be representative of their own individual ideas? My answer to you would be just study your target very well, know what are the things that are special about your region, and try to build a collective intelligence model inspired from the basics of what makes collective intelligence emerge, but also make sure to take into consideration the characteristics and try to build on them. If that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. And thank you, Titus Alexander, for the contribution. And I really want to acknowledge the really interesting discussions that have been going on in the chat. I love that we are able to have those conversations because I think that's really important. And webinar about democracy. So thank you so much to all of our speakers and to everyone, all of the guests who attended today. I want to also thank my colleagues, Maria Olympia and our director, Alan Metajo, and also acknowledge the presence of Participedia with us today. Thank you so much for your patience. I hope the discussion has been rewarding for you, and we are looking forward to having you all again at our next events. And we encourage you to follow, if you haven't done that yet, to follow Africa Pulse on the different social media platforms where we are, so you can stay connected. If you want to hear anything about the discussions that have been done today, you want to reach out to the speakers, or just to know about the events we'll be planning in the future. Thank you so much, and I really wish you a great rest of your day.